We are often taught that authority flows from above, a pristine, linear climb through elite institutions where access is granted only through formal degrees and the specific blessing of gatekeepers. For millions of people, that clean path simply does not exist. Instead, they are forced to navigate a hidden handbook of systemic walls. They encounter opaque bureaucratic rules, implicit tracking in schools, and steep limitations projected onto them based entirely on their zip code, their surname, or their ethnic identity. When you face those walls long enough, the damage turns inward. You start to mistake your ignorance of a rigged system for a lack of personal worth. A missing diploma mutates into a quiet, persistent inferiority complex. The false belief that your lack of institutional credentials means you lack intellectual capacity. But there is a sharp divide between formal education and actual formation. Receiving a credential simply means a system has approved you. Forging your character through friction means you have tested yourself. The truest, hardest journey of leadership requires stepping completely outside the traditional classroom. You take your unanswered questions, your isolation, and your setbacks, and you build a private academy of your own. As we see in antique texts like this Bible, ancient self-directed study has long been the method for finding wisdom when modern institutions close their doors. Taking control of your own formation means entering a new kind of conflict. The most difficult barrier to leadership is rarely the free market or a rigid bureaucracy. The hardest terrain to conquer is the leader's own mind. This psychological cross-section reveals the internal drivers of a developing leader. When you peel back the layers, you often see unhealed psychological wounds disguised as virtues. What looks like pure ambition is often driven by a deep fear of being overlooked. Intense passion may actually be unresolved anger. And what a founder calls a grand vision is frequently a desperate, insatiable need for approval. Stripping away those disguises requires a ruthless tool, the intense discipline of the journal. Writing here serves to forcefully slow down the gears of thought, holding them up to the light to separate ego from actual wisdom. By confessing your ignorance and naming your fears in the privacy of a notebook, you build internal load-bearing walls. You master yourself in the dark, so you do not collapse under the immense weight of public capability. Once you govern your own mind, you have to learn how external power operates. A self-educated leader must study the exact mechanics of the rigid systems that once categorized and overlooked them. Consider the massive, intimidating scale of a naval destroyer. Military service places a person inside an unforgiving structure. Submitting to that intense hierarchy teaches you that extreme discipline is not a cage meant to limit you. It is a tool meant to refine your reliability under immense pressure. That same critical observation applies to the bureaucratic maze. Look at these rows of retro office cubicles and typewriters. Here, you witness firsthand how abstract policies, paperwork, and the quiet discretion of officials can either quietly crush a person's dignity at the counter or be wielded with mercy to serve them. Conquering these environments is vital. It shows you precisely how institutional doors are constructed, who guards them, and how the locks turn. You need that knowledge to eventually pry those same doors open for the people standing behind you. Moving from institutions into the free market introduces a new layer of pressure. Inspiration is cheap. In entrepreneurship, your private discipline is violently tested by brutal realities of contracts, budgets, complex negotiations, and the constant hovering risk of ruin. In this space, opportunity almost never arrives clean and complete. It usually shows up disguised as a neglected problem, a broken relationship, or a massive risk that requires cold, sober calculation. This split-screen ledger illustrates why navigating those risks requires a practice called emotional accounting. On the left, financial metrics like revenue and margin are steadily climbing, but on the right, an emotional ledger of unchecked pride and stubbornness is sharply dropping, and that unseen deficit will cause the entire structure to violently crack. Bad emotional math will ruin a business long before the money runs out. The unforgiving market forces a leader to reframe their relationship with setbacks. A failed venture is never a final verdict on your character or personal worth. It is simply the expensive, necessary tuition you must pay to master the mechanics of execution. Surviving those battlegrounds, the mind, the institutions, and the market, triggers a permanent shift in perspective. You stop asking what you can extract from your work and start asking why you are building in the first place. An untrained, insecure leader views authority as a crown, worn to prove their importance and silence their past humiliations. But as this crown tarnishes and dissolves into raw stones, we see the reality. A mature leader views authority as a heavy weight placed in calloused hands. It is the demanding burden of stewardship. This is the practice of redemptive leadership. You take the exact barriers that tried to break you, the lack of access, the systemic exclusion, the imposter syndrome, and you use them to become hyper-attentive to the struggles of the overlooked. You no longer need to wait for a formal institution to declare you educated. You stop waiting to be chosen or validated by traditional gatekeepers. Instead, you treat your current obstacles, your daily frictions, and your hidden disciplines as your true, bespoke syllabus. You let the resistance itself teach you how to lead. You have one central mandate: become the architect of your own becoming. Take what you have learned, build a door where you once met a solid wall, and become the kind of leader whose rising helps others rise.
Imagine you're in high school, right? You're sitting at your desk, first day of class. The teacher's reading down the attendance sheet, just calling out names.
Yeah, that classic first day tension.
Exactly. The rhythm is steady, totally predictable, until they get to you. And before you've even spoken a single word, the teacher just pauses over your last name.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
They stumble, they hesitate, they squint at the paper. It's just this half-second hesitation. But in that tiny fraction of a moment, your entire future is sort of subtly rewritten.
You become a complication.
Right, an exception. And today on our deep dive, we're looking at what happens when the education system quietly decides you just don't belong. And, how one man reacted to that subtle exclusion by basically building a private Ivy League university entirely inside his own mind.
It's just such an incredible premise because it really forces us to look at the mechanisms of how we assign value to human potential. The journals and memoirs we're exploring today belong to Gilbert Villalpando, or Gino, specifically his works Becoming the Man I Was Not Taught to Be and Beyond Diplomas.
Right.
And when you dig into these texts, you're not just reading a traditional memoir of, someone who worked hard and made it. You are reading a tactical, philosophical blueprint for the self-educated soul.
Yeah, it's intense.
He goes from this profoundly overlooked student, someone who deeply internalized this systemic sense of inferiority, to an incredibly grounded entrepreneurial leader.
And the whole mission of this deep dive today is to basically tear that blueprint apart to see exactly how it works. We want to understand how Gino completely bypassed the limitations of the traditional classroom.
Yeah, the traditional structures just weren't there for him.
Right, and how he built this staggeringly rigorous curriculum out of ancient poetry, meticulous journaling, and just raw, often painful life experience.
It's amazing.
But more than that, we're looking at how he forged a philosophy of leadership that's rooted in the very ethnic identity that those early institutions, tried to make him ashamed of. It's really a masterclass in stewardship.
What stands out to me instantly in his journals is this concept of translation. Gino's life is a masterclass in how a marginalized individual takes systemic exclusion, all those closed doors, all those lowered expectations.
All those paused pronunciations of his name.
Yes, exactly. And he uses that exact material to build a resilient path to leadership. He doesn't just survive the exclusion, he literally metabolizes it.
He turns the things that were meant to keep him out into the mortar for his own foundation.
Right. He builds with it.
And to understand how he builds that foundation, we really have to go back to the site of what he calls the first wound, which is the traditional classroom.
The classroom, yeah.
Because reading his accounts of high school, what struck me was that it wasn't these massive cinematic moments of dramatic rejection. It wasn't some cartoon villain teacher telling him he was worthless.
No, it's much quieter than that.
It's the quiet, insidious things, like that pause over his surname.
That specific detail, that pause, it's a perfect example of a micro interaction carrying a macro message. When a young person hears an authority figure hesitate over their name, or even sees them subtly adjust their posture or use a slightly different tone, it communicates this really clear, unspoken rule.
Which is what exactly?
It says, you require explanation. You are not the default setting here. To a teenager who's just trying to figure out where they fit in the world, that pause translates directly into I am a burden to the system.
Yeah. And if you're listening to this right now and you've ever sat in like a corporate meeting or a university lecture hall feeling like you somehow missed the secret orientation day that everyone else apparently went to, this next part is going to explain exactly why.
Oh, absolutely.
Because Gino talks about the guidance counselor.
Yeah.
He describes sitting in this small office, and the counselor is discussing futures, but they're using these very measured, careful tones.
Lowering expectations.
Right. The counselor subtly suggests smaller, safer futures. Community college, trade school, local job. Again, nobody outright said, Gino, you can't achieve anything.
Right. It's not explicit.
But the imagination of the room was completely constrained. The institution could only imagine a very narrow, safe path for a boy from his specific neighborhood.
Yeah.
He walked out holding those brochures, wondering if ambition itself was something he needed permission for.
The psychological weight of that is just immense. What Gino is bumping up against here is the absence of the hidden handbook of opportunity.
The hidden handbook, I love that concept.
It's so real, though. Every institution, whether it's a high school, a university, a Fortune 500 company, they all have two curriculums. You have the official one, the syllabus, the employee handbook.
Sure, the stuff they hand you on day one.
Exactly. But then there is the invisible curriculum running beneath it. It's the unspoken knowledge of, which classes actually matter, which managers hold the real keys to open doors.
How to leverage a network.
Yes, or just how to speak to an authority figure with the baked-in assumption that your questions inherently deserve answers.
And he watched his peers use that handbook. He writes about watching other students navigate these educational spaces with this cultivated, effortless confidence. Like they would walk up to a teacher after class and ask for help or debate a grade, and he would just sit there in total awe, but also in deep self-judgment.
He thought they were just naturally smarter or braver.
Right. He didn't realize until years later that their confidence wasn't natural. It was inherited. It was rehearsed at the dinner table. They'd been taught by their parents how to move through institutional spaces with a fundamental sense of ownership.
Precisely. And this is where the system becomes actively harmful. Because when you don't possess that hidden handbook, you don't blame the system for not giving it to you. You blame yourself.
You internalize it.
You do. Gino internalizes this systemic exclusion as a personal, inherent lack of intelligence. He sits in these rooms, utterly silent, and he wonders if his silence proves he's deficient. It shows how profoundly systems name a young person long before they have the vocabulary to name themselves. A class schedule, being cracked into standard instead of honors, a counselor's glance. These mechanisms teach a student exactly where society expects them to fit.
I really want to stop and think about that.
Yeah.
Because we always talk about education like it's this pure meritocracy. Like it's a race where everyone starts at the exact same starting line.
Right, which is a myth.
It's way more like being placed on a really complex subway system, and you are the only passenger who didn't receive a map of the stops.
That's a great analogy.
And then, when you end up at the wrong station or you miss your transfer, you don't think, oh, the transit authority failed to provide a map. You think, I must be incredibly stupid because everyone else seems to know exactly when to get off the train.
Right, you blame your own navigation skills.
Exactly. The traditional classroom isn't necessarily a perfect gauge of potential. In many ways, it's just a gauge of assimilation. It doesn't know how to read the specific intelligence that a marginalized student brings into the room.
That is a crucial distinction. Gino realizes much later that intelligence can live very quietly before it finds the right language to express itself. He argues that marginalized students are not empty vessels walking into a classroom. They are, to use his word, untranslated.
Untranslated.
Yes. They bring immense cultural knowledge, survival skills, complex familial responsibilities, deep spiritual instincts.
But the school doesn't see that.
No, because the institution has no standardized metric for it. There's no multiple choice test to measure the ability to navigate a mixed status neighborhood.
Right.
Or the resilience required to translate legal documents for your parents when you're 10 years old.
So the student is simply deemed lacking.
Exactly.
So the system can't read him, and he can't read the system. What does he do? Because this is where the story pivots from, like a tragedy of exclusion, into this staggering act of rebellion.
It really is a rebellion.
If the traditional map is missing, he decides he has to draw his own. He stops waiting for the institution to give him permission to be brilliant.
He takes control.
He realizes that this effortless confidence he saw in his peers is a luxury he wasn't born with. So he decides to earn it brutally through sheer discipline. He builds his own syllabus.
And this syllabus is nothing short of extraordinary. I mean, when you look at the sources Gino shows for his private internal academy, he didn't just go to the library and pick up standard business textbooks or, how to get rich manuals.
Right, no self-help flick.
He bypassed the contemporary completely and went straight to the absolute bedrock foundations of human history and philosophical thought.
Wild.
He built a syllabus that vastly surpassed conventional academic requirements in its moral and philosophical rigor. He broke his primary reading down into two main categories: biblical leaders and classical Roman poets.
Okay, let's unpack the biblical library first, because what fascinated me here is that he isn't reading these texts for a Sunday school lesson.
Not at all.
He isn't reading them with this distant pious reverence or, preparing for a theology exam. He is aggressively mining them as case studies for leadership.
Yes, looking for practical tools.
He studies Moses, David, Nehemiah, Joseph, Gideon, and he's extracting deeply practical psychological mechanics from their lives.
Yeah, he completely strips away that mythological stained glass distance we usually apply to these figures. Like, let's look at Moses.
Okay, yeah.
When Gino reads the Exodus story, he doesn't just see the miracles. He looks at Moses and sees a man paralyzed by profound imposter syndrome.
Which is so relatable.
It is. Before confronting Pharaoh, Moses literally stutters and argues with the divine. He asks, "Who am I to do this? They won't listen to me. I don't have the words."
Right.
For a young man like Gino, who felt entirely unqualified, who lacked the diplomas and the pedigree, seeing a foundational historical figure doubt his own adequacy was completely revolutionary.
It basically validated the insecurity while simultaneously demanding that he move past it.
Exactly. It proved that feeling unqualified is not a disqualification. It's often the prerequisite for the job. And then you have Nehemiah.
Oh, man, I love his take on Nehemiah. Because most people read Nehemiah as a story about religious restoration.
Right, rebuilding the temple walls.
Yeah, but Gino studies Nehemiah for entrepreneurial organization and logistics. He looks at Nehemiah standing in front of the broken, burned down walls of Jerusalem.
And Nehemiah doesn't just sit in the ashes and cry.
Right. He doesn't just pray and wait for magic. He organizes people by family units. He delegates tasks. He manages supply chains. He sets up a defense system while they work.
Project management.
Totally. Gino looks at that and sees the ultimate entrepreneur. Yeah. Someone who looks at absolute ruin and immediately figures out the practical logistics of restoration.
It is a profound way to read the text. Entrepreneurship isn't just about inventing a new app. It's about looking at what's broken in your community and organizing the capital, the labor, and the vision to rebuild the wall.
Yeah.
And then, perhaps most interestingly, he looks at Gideon.
Gideon, who is literally hiding in a wine press when he is called to lead.
Right. Gideon is threshing wheat in a wine press to hide it from the Midianites. He is terrified. He's the youngest of the weakest clan.
Talk about imposter syndrome.
Exactly. Gino relates intensely to that hidden fear, the need to conceal what little you have so it isn't taken from you. But what Gino learns from Gideon is that courage is not the absence of fear.
It's action despite it.
Courage is trembling obedience.
Yeah.
God, or destiny, didn't wait for Gideon or Moses to go get a degree in military strategy.
Right.
They were not polished before they were assigned massive burdens. Their faith didn't magically erase their weakness. It gave their weakness direction. Man, that makes so much sense in the context of his spiritual upbringing. Yeah.
But I have to stop you here because this next part actually bothers me a little bit.
Okay.
I want to push back on his second category of text. We have the biblical text, which makes perfect sense for his cultural background.
Right.
But then we have his other tutors, the Roman poets, Virgil, Horace, Ovid. I read this and thought, wait a minute.
I know where you're going with this.
Reading dead Roman poets is like the most stereotypically elite, oppressive academic thing you can possibly do. It's exactly what they do in the ivy-covered halls that rejected him.
It seems like a contradiction.
Yeah, by obsessing over Virgil, isn't Gino just capitulating to the oppressor's standards? Why didn't he build a syllabus of indigenous revolutionaries or modern marginalized writers who actually share his background? Why does a kid from the borderlands need dead Romans?
It's a fantastic question, and it's a brilliant paradox in his story. It looks like capitulation on the surface. But if you look at the psychological mechanics of why and how he was reading them, the distinction becomes clear.
Okay, break that down for me.
Think about an Ivy League student. Traditionally, they read Virgil to pass a test. They read the Aeneid to get an A. To acquire a credential that proves they belong to the elite ruling class.
To signal their sophistication at dinner parties.
Exactly. Gino wasn't reading them for a diploma. He was reading them because he was drowning and they were a raft.
A raft.
He apprenticed himself to them as a matter of raw survival. He needed their expansive language to understand the scale of his own life.
So he isn't reading them to join the elite club. He's basically raiding their library for tools.
Precisely. Let's look at what he actually takes from them, starting with Virgil. Gino writes that Virgil taught him the concept of pietas.
Pietas.
We often translate that as piety, but in the Roman sense it means duty. Devotion to your family, your gods, and your state.
Duty over glory.
Right. In Virgil's Aeneid, the hero, Aeneas, doesn't get to just go have fun adventures. He's a man forced to carry the ruins of his past, literally carrying his elderly father on his back out of the burning city of Troy into a completely unknown future.
Wow.
Aeneas has to leave everything he loves to found a new city, Rome, that he will barely get to enjoy.
Okay, when you put it like that, the connection is instantly clear. Aeneas is in exile.
Yes. For Gino, a young man carrying the intense heavy weight of his ethnic identity, his family's immigrant history, the sacrifices of his parents, and this massive pressure to build a new legacy, Aeneas is a mirror.
That makes total sense.
Virgil made destiny feel costly. Reading the Aeneid challenged Gino's desire for mere personal wealth or glory. It taught him that a true founder is disciplined by obligation.
Right.
It asked him a brutal question. Are your ambitions large enough to actually serve and shelter your community, or are they just large enough to decorate your own ego?
Wow. He reads the quintessential text of empire building, but he reads it through the lens of a refugee carrying his father. That completely flips the script.
It really does.
And then he moves to Horace. Horace is the philosopher of the golden mean, right?
Yeah.
The middle path.
Exactly. Horace taught him emotional moderation, the extreme danger of excess. In Horace's poetry, you see a deep suspicion of both crushing poverty and obscenely excessive wealth, of too much ambition and too much fear.
Balance.
Yes. For someone like Gino, who felt this intense, almost frantic pressure to prove himself, to move incredibly fast and loudly, to overcompensate for his lack of formal credentials, Horace was a brake pedal.
Horace told him to slow down.
Horace gave him permission to seek balance, to understand that if you build your life on the frantic energy of trying to prove your haters wrong, you will burn out. Horace taught him to govern himself rather than inflate himself.
I love that. And finally, Ovid. Ovid writes the Metamorphoses, which is this massive epic entirely about transformation. Why was Ovid crucial to Gino's syllabus?
Gino writes that Ovid taught him the unsettling but ultimately empowering truth that identity is never fixed.
Never fixed.
In the Metamorphoses, bodies change into trees, into birds, into constellations. Grief changes shape. Trauma alters the physical form. What's fascinating here is why Gino needed that specific chaotic vision.
Well, because his deepest fear was being stuck.
Exactly. Remember, his deepest fear was that he was permanently trapped by what he lacked. He feared that his lack of formal education, his socioeconomic status, that early tracking in high school, had already permanently named him.
That the die was cast.
Right. Ovid proved to him on a grand methodological scale that a man's form is not final.
Oh man, if everything in the universe is subject to transformation, then a high school transcript is definitely not final.
Absolutely right. It meant that shame can be transformed into language. Exile can be transmuted into perspective. A wound can become art. Instability itself, which was the defining feature of his early life, becomes the raw material for creation.
So he takes these massive, heavy concepts from Moses and Ovid. But just reading isn't enough, right? Like, if I read a book on quantum physics, I don't become a physicist.
Right, you're just a guy with a book.
I just become a guy who read a book.
Yeah.
To synthesize this knowledge, you really need a laboratory. You have to process it. And for Gino, he had to create a space to do that processing, which leads us to his primary tool for intellectual growth, his writing.
And writing was not a hobby for Gino. It wasn't something he did to relax on the weekends. It was the absolute architecture of his intellectual reclamation.
It was a tool.
A vital tool. It was the physical mechanism he used to combat his inferiority complex. When he was in conversation with traditionally educated, wealthy men, he often felt slow, defensive, always a step behind. But on the page, he controlled the speed of thought.
He built what he calls a 3-tiered writing system: journaling, essay writing, and fiction. And I really want to dig into the mechanics of this because I think it's so applicable to anyone trying to organize a chaotic mind.
Oh, totally.
He calls journaling the first room in his private academy. But how did he actually use it? Was it just like a Dear Diary situation?
Not at all. Think of journaling as emptying your pockets after a long, exhausting trip. You're just dumping out all the receipts, the lint, the loose change to see what you actually collected that day.
Okay, I see.
It was the space for raw, unedited, emotional honesty. It was the one place in his entire life where he could arrive completely without credentials.
He didn't have to perform.
Exactly. He didn't have to pretend to be a finished, polished leader. He could confess his envy of other businessmen, his deep fear of financial ruin, his anger at systemic racism, and he could do it before any of those emotions harden into toxic resentment or brittle pride.
So it's basically a release valve.
It is, but it also evolves over time. He notes that at first, his journals were just chaotic emotional storms. But over time, the discipline of writing daily, and crucially, the act of going back and reading old entries, made him both the witness and the student of his own life.
He's studying his own patterns.
Right. He began to look at an entry from 6 months prior and ask, what was the actual mechanism of my fear here? Why did that specific comment from a bank loan officer send me into a spiral?
So journaling is the data collection. You are getting the receipts, but then you have to do something with that data. That brings us to the second tier, which is essay writing.
If the journal is emptying your pockets, the essay is taking those receipts and brutally auditing your own emotional bank account. Yes, essays forced intellectual responsibility. You can rant and rave in a journal. You cannot rant in an essay.
Sure.
The form of an essay demands that you define a specific question, construct a logical argument, weigh the opposing evidence, and arrive at a defensible truth. He literally assigned himself topics, money, faith, cultural inheritance, the anatomy of shame, just like a rigorous professor would.
And he talks extensively about the absolute agony of revision. This stood out to me so much. He says that the first draft makes you feel like a genius, but revision humbles you. Why is revision such a critical part of his leadership training?
Because revision is the physical act of killing your own ego.
Wow.
In a first draft, you write sentences that sound beautiful to you, sentences that show off your vocabulary. But in revision, you have to look at that beautiful sentence and ask, does this actually serve the truth of the argument, or does it just serve my vanity?
And if it's vanity, it goes.
You have to cut it. Gino viewed that grueling process of cutting his own beloved words as leadership training in miniature. Listen to the feedback, correct the error, clarify the vision, remove what weakens the structure even if you love it, and build again.
That's incredible.
The willingness to revise a sentence on a page translates directly to the willingness to revise your own behavior in a boardroom.
That is brilliant. Okay, so we have the data collection in the journals,
Yeah.
the intellectual auditing in the essays, but the third tier is fiction, or storytelling. He wrote these expansive narratives, the Casanova series and Lanterns in the Rain. And at first glance, you might think, why is an aspiring entrepreneur, someone focused on business and leadership, wasting time writing novels?
Fiction was the simulation room. Fiction allowed him to rehearse leadership under extreme pressure without real-world casualties.
My analogy for this is, if journaling is drawing up the blueprints and essays are actually framing the house, fiction is walking through the finished rooms, turning on the faucets, testing the floorboards, and seeing if a human being can actually survive living in that architecture.
That is a perfect analogy.
You're testing your philosophical theories against human conflict.
That is exactly it. Fiction allowed him to take his own deeply personal wounds and place them at a safe, objective distance.
Right.
By creating a character who was tested by loss, tempted by arrogance, and called to build something from nothing, Gino was indirectly figuring out how he should navigate those exact same storms. He discovered his own redemptive leadership style not by taking a seminar, but by writing a hero who had to earn it on the page.
And we cannot move on without talking about his signature conceptual tool, which he developed through his fiction, but applied to his real life.
The braided scene.
Oh, this is so important.
Because this completely changed how I view my own setbacks. A braided scene, according to Gino, has 5 layers: action, wound, symbol, choice, and revelation. 5 layers of meaning.
Right. I mean, nothing is ever just the surface level event.
Great.
Let's actually try to build one right now so you, listening, can see how this works. Let's take a relatable, modern example.
Okay, lay it on me.
Let's say you're listening to this, and you just got passed over for a major promotion at work. They gave it to the new guy who has half your experience but a fancier degree.
Okay, let's break that down using Gino's method. First, the action. This is the physical reality. You're sitting in your boss's office. The boss slides a piece of paper across the desk and says, "We went with someone else." That is the action.
Right. But it's never just about the job. What is the wound?
The wound is the deep historical pain that this specific action triggers. The wound isn't just, I didn't get more money. The wound is the feeling of being invisible.
Oh, man.
It is the echo of every time in your life you worked twice as hard only to be overlooked in favor of someone who simply looked the part. It triggers the old fear that merit doesn't matter, only pedigree does.
That's heavy. And then the symbol. What is the physical object in the room that holds all this weight?
Maybe the symbol is the glass wall of the boss's office. You are sitting inside it, but you can see the rest of the company out there. It represents transparency that is actually a barrier.
You could look, but you can't touch.
Exactly. You can see the top, but you can't get there. It's hard, cold, and designed to keep you in your place while pretending you're part of the team.
Oof. Okay, so you have the action, the wound, the symbol. Now comes the crucial part, the choice.
The choice is the pivot point of leadership. In that moment, staring through the glass wall, you have to decide. Do I let this rejection validate my deepest insecurities, turn bitter, and quietly sabotage the new guy?
Right.
Or do I recognize that this company's inability to read my value does not diminish my actual value?
Which leads to the revelation.
The revelation. You realize that your ambition has been tethered to seeking validation from a system that was not built for you.
Wow.
The revelation is that you don't need a corner office in this building. You need to start your own firm. The rejection wasn't a failure. It was an eviction notice pushing you toward your actual purpose.
That is unbelievable. By running a painful moment through that 5-step filter, you take all the chaotic emotion out of it and turn it into a tactical map.
You regain control.
He uses this literary technique to psychoanalyze his own journey. He takes his own life, which felt messy and painful, and reads it like it's a classic novel with a purpose.
And that level of self-awareness is incredible. But as we know, building this refined internal architecture is one thing when you're sitting quietly at a desk writing.
It's just theory at that point.
Right. Eventually, he had to take this private academy and slam it into the brick wall of the real world. He had to test these theories against rigid, unforgiving institutional structures. This is the crucible of systems. His time in the military and in the civil service.
Entering those massive bureaucratic systems must have been a profound shock to his carefully constructed inner world. Like he spent years reading Virgil and analyzing his emotions in journals, and then suddenly he is in the military, where nobody cares about your internal braided scene.
Exactly. The military and the civil service operate on strict hierarchy, rigid procedure, and institutional momentum. They don't care about your philosophy.
No.
They expose a person to the raw, unvarnished realities of power, logistics, and prejudice in ways a private journal never will.
Let's talk about the military first. He joins the Navy, gets assigned to a ship, and quickly learns that all his grand poetic visions of leadership have to immediately submit to the reality of a daily maintenance schedule.
It grounds you instantly.
He writes that the military completely stripped away his neighborhood illusions of what manhood and leadership look like. In his youth, strength might have been volume, defiance, or never backing down from a fight.
But the physics of a warship don't care about your defiance.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is, the military taught him that responsibility is not an abstract virtue that you ponder poetically in a notebook. Responsibility is the grueling, practical reliability that other human beings' lives depend on.
Literal life or death.
If you are tasked with checking the pressure valves on a boiler deep in the hull of a ship, and you get distracted by your own ego or laziness, it doesn't just hurt your pride, the ship explodes.
The stakes obliterate the ego.
Precisely. It taught him punctuality, relentless attention to detail, and the ability to do vital, necessary work in the dark without any applause. And it taught him the mechanics of emotional containment.
Tell me more about that. How does the military rewire your nervous system to contain emotion? Because he was dealing with prejudice, exhaustion, terrible bosses, tight quarters. How did he not explode?
When you are trapped in a steel box in the middle of the ocean for 6 months with people who may not like you and whom you may not like, you cannot indulge every frustration.
I just can't.
You cannot throw a tantrum every time you're misunderstood. The military forced him to learn how to carry intense anger or profound homesickness without letting it command his mouth or dictate his actions. He had to learn to feel deeply. He didn't turn off his emotions, but he had to act purposefully, not recklessly.
And that emotional containment becomes the bedrock of his later success in business, right? Because if a CEO panics every time there's a supply chain issue, the whole company panics.
Yeah.
People follow the emotional weather of the leader.
Exactly. The military gave him the endurance to stand on the bridge during a storm without capsizing his own team with his anxiety.
Wow.
But then he leaves the military and enters an entirely different kind of system. He goes to work in the civil service, and his essays detailing this period are some of the most heartbreaking, eye-opening writing in his entire memoir.
He's working inside public agencies, literally sitting behind the counter. And from that vantage point, he sees firsthand how institutional bureaucracy creates massive, almost insurmountable hurdles for marginalized people.
This period radically alters his understanding of the American dream. The popular rhetoric of the American dream is that it's a ladder. If you just work hard enough, you climb the rung.
Meritocracy again.
Right. But sitting behind the civil service desk, Gino sees that for immigrants, for the poor, for the uneducated, the dream is not a ladder, it is a labyrinth.
A maze.
It's a terrifying maze of triplicate forms, confusing legal notices, opaque regulations, and a pervasive fear of authority.
He paints these incredibly vivid sensory scenes of the bureaucracy. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the waiting rooms, families standing at public counters, instinctively lowering their voices to a whisper so they don't draw attention to themselves.
Just trying to be invisible.
He describes how they carry these folded documents, birth certificates, utility bills, letters treating them like fragile, desperate proof of their own legitimacy. And they are absolutely terrified.
Because they know the stakes?
Because they know that a single missing signature or a misunderstood rule due to a language barrier will confirm what they already suspect, that the system doesn't want them, and they are about to be rejected and sent back to square one.
And Gino, sitting on the other side of the glass, recognizes the immense arbitrary power dynamics at play. He sees how the discretion of a single underpaid clerk can change the trajectory of a family's life.
That's right.
Bureaucracy is never neutral. A clerk's mood can be wielded as a weapon of contempt. A complicated rule can be explained with patience, helping a family navigate the maze, or it can be used to humiliate them.
I really have to jump in here because reading this part of the book, I was like screaming internally.
That's so frustrating.
If these systems are this broken, this exhausting, this degrading for people from his background, why on earth does he participate in them? Why doesn't he just walk away, go live in the woods, start a commune, reject the whole bureaucratic maze entirely?
That is the defining question of his life, and his answer to it marks the most crucial pivot in his entire journey.
Okay, what is it?
He realizes that a true leader cannot simply stand on the outside, throwing rocks at the building, critiquing the maze. The pivot is the transition from merely navigating broken systems to deciding to build his own systems.
He decides to become an architect instead of just a critic.
Exactly. He understands that if you just walk away in disgust, the system remains exactly as it is, continuing to crush the people who don't have the luxury or the resources to walk away.
Somebody has to stay.
He writes this incredible thought. A leader cannot just dream of open doors. They must study how doors are built, how they are guarded, the mechanics of the locks, and who holds the keys, so that they can learn how to build wider, more humane doors themselves.
He must learn how doors are built, guarded, and locked, so he can build more humane ones. Man, that gives me chills. That realization right there is the birth of his entrepreneurial drive.
It changes everything.
He isn't getting into business to buy a sports car. He's getting into business to build better doors. But building requires resources, structure, and a completely different mindset. Which brings us to his philosophy of business, the shift from seeking inheritance to embracing stewardship.
When Gino first starts out as an entrepreneur, he's very honest about his flaws. He admits that initially he was largely driven by a desperate need to prove his worth.
A chip on his shoulder.
A huge one. He wanted the outward markers of success. The land, the production company, the titles to announce to the world, and specifically to those who had underestimated him in his youth, that he mattered. He wanted an inheritance.
He wanted the crown.
But he learns, through very harsh, very expensive failures, that true entrepreneurial leadership requires a complete transformation of motive.
He writes an entire section on the entrepreneurial lessons he had to earn. And he brings his psychological training, his journaling, and essay writing straight into the boardroom. He introduces this concept of emotional accounting in business. Explain how that works, because it's not just about profit and loss margins on a spreadsheet.
No, emotional accounting is recognizing that the psychology of the founder is baked into the foundation of the business.
Okay.
Gino argues that if you carry unresolved trauma, resentment, or a desperate need for ego validation into a business negotiation, it will rot the deal from the inside out.
It leaks into the culture.
If you hire people because they feed your ego rather than challenge your vision, your company is weak. The financial numbers might look fantastic on paper for a few years, but the foundation is quietly cracking.
This is exactly why his self-education, reading Ovid and Horace and auditing himself in his essays, is what makes him a resilient leader.
Exactly. Because he didn't learn business in a sterile MBA classroom, he learned it through the pain of doing it wrong in the real world. He famously calls failure his tuition.
Tuition, I love that.
And because he paid heavy tuition for every single lesson, he views business completely differently than a standard corporate rater. He views entrepreneurship not as wealth accumulation, but as the act of arranging chaos into purpose.
I love the imagery he uses to describe this. He goes back to the earth, the vineyard. He says that inheritance isn't a golden crown placed on your head while everyone claps for you. It's a heavy weight placed in your hand.
There's a responsibility.
The vineyard doesn't ask you to boast about owning it. It demands that you wake up at dawn and cultivate it.
And he also uses the imagery of the cup. He writes that the cup doesn't ask you to drink deeply of your own pride. It asks you to remember the immense cost of what was poured out before you, the blood, sweat, and sacrifices of the generations that preceded you.
Generational awareness.
This is the absolute essence of stewardship. Stewardship is taking whatever exists in your hands, whether it's financial capital, an artistic skill, cultural memory, or literally a plot of land and arranging it toward life. It is taking something broken and making it useful and sheltering.
Let me offer an analogy to contrast this. Most entrepreneurs today, especially in the tech and corporate spaces, are taught the language of conquerors.
Oh, very much so.
You're taught to plant your flag, capture the market, disrupt the industry, crush the competition. It's very militaristic, aggressive language. But Gino is acting like a cultivator. He looks at his production company, Casanova, and he isn't asking, how do I crush my rivals?
No, he's asking a different question entirely.
He's asking, who am I sheltering with this business? What cultural wounds does this organization have the power to answer?
That is the defining characteristic of a leader who has been forged in the crucible of marginalization and self-education. They don't just want to build a monument to their own greatness. They desperately want to build an ecosystem that sustains others.
Right.
And this deep sense of stewardship, this drive to shelter people, is inextricably linked to the very thing that once caused him the most pain, which is his ethnic identity.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most profound theme of his entire journey, the borderlands of leadership. Because early on in his life, his ethnic identity was a massive source of anxiety, wasn't it? It was the reason the teacher paused over his name.
It was a source of profound daily vulnerability. In his essays on growing up, he writes about the exhausting burden of being treated as a demographic category before being received as an individual human being. He dealt with the constant stereotypes, the lazy assumptions about his intelligence or his future, the intense pressure to code switch just to survive in institutional spaces. He talks specifically about immigration status anxiety. Even when it wasn't his immediate, direct legal struggle, it was the emotional weather of his entire community.
He describes the atmosphere in the neighborhood so vividly. The sudden silence at the family dinner table when certain news came on.
Yes.
The mixed status fears where visibility literally equals danger, where children learn far too early that their belonging in the country is conditional and that standing out, even for something good, can invite a threat to their family.
It's a heavy burden for a kid.
But then he contrasts that systemic fear with the immense quiet dignity taught in those exact same kitchens. Mothers refusing to let fear define their children's horizons. Fathers working brutal manual labor jobs without a shred of public recognition, but doing it with absolute honor.
For a long time, Gino felt crushed between these two realities, the dignity of his home and the disdain of the system. And his initial, totally understandable reaction to the injury of prejudice was a desire for revenge through excellence.
Revenge through excellence. That is such a common driver for ambitious people.
It is. He wanted to use his success as armor. He wanted his ancestry, his name, to answer with thunder. He wanted to become so wealthy, so educated, so undeniable that he could shove his success in the face of every counselor, every clerk, every teacher who had ever dismissed him.
But then he has this massive philosophical breakthrough. He writes this line that stopped me in my tracks. He realizes he must not turn a wound into a throne.
A wound into a throne.
Let's dig deep into this.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean in the day-to-day practice of leadership? Because it sounds poetic, but how does it work?
It is the most vital warning in his entire philosophy. To turn a wound into a throne means that you use your trauma as the justification for your power. If you use your success merely to seek revenge against the people who underestimated you, if your whole drive is, I'll show them, you are still letting them author your life. Your entire trajectory is still just a reaction to their ignorance. They're still sitting in the director's chair of your mind.
You are letting your haters write your script.
Exactly. And ruling from your pain, making your wound your throne, means you become hypersensitive, bitter, and heavily guarded. You demand constant validation, and eventually you become an oppressor yourself because you view every interaction as a threat.
You're always on defense.
You make every boardroom, every meeting a courtroom where you are constantly trying to litigate your own worth.
Wow. So to become a true steward, he had to learn the incredibly disciplined art of carrying his memory, honoring his cultural history, without becoming captive to the pain of it. He had to explicitly refuse bitterness as an inheritance.
And the moment he does that, the moment he lays down the need for revenge, his ethnic identity completely transforms. It goes from being a liability in the eyes of the system into his absolute greatest leadership superpower.
Because he understands what it takes.
Because Gino knows exactly what it feels like to be translated before he speaks. Because he knows the humiliation of having his name paused over, or what it feels like to hold a folded document in terror at a public counter. He knows exactly why marginalized students and overlooked people require self-built paths.
His empathy isn't theoretical. It is operational. So if I were to ask you, what is the ultimate advantage of the leader who comes from the borderlands? The leader who didn't have the clean subway map, who had to read Ovid to survive, who had to audit their own emotions in a journal?
The ultimate advantage is an unparalleled capacity for translation and hospitality.
Hospitality.
A leader from the borderlands knows how to stand comfortably between worlds without despising either one. They can speak the high-level strategic language of the corporate boardroom, and they can speak the grounded survival language of the community kitchen, and they can translate between the two.
To become the bridge.
They build businesses, ministries, and production companies that function as the exact doors, the exact tables, the exact lamps and bridges that they themselves once desperately needed but couldn't find. They don't just succeed within the existing architecture. They fundamentally alter the architecture of access for everyone coming up behind them.
That just takes my breath away. What a staggering journey. From a kid shrinking in a counselor's office, internalizing the idea that he wasn't meant for much, to a man building a literal and metaphorical empire of shelter.
It's an amazing transformation.
It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that formal education, the diplomas, the ivy-covered brick buildings, the official syllabus, and true, deep human formation are not always the same thing.
They're often vastly different. Gino earned his education not by sitting passively in a lecture hall waiting to be told what to think. He earned it by turning his deepest wounds into a rigorous syllabus. By wrestling in the dark with classical wisdom, processing it through grueling daily writing, failing in business and calling it tuition, and ultimately choosing the heavy lifting of stewardship over the cheap thrill of ego.
He didn't just get an education. He built a legacy. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to turn the focus directly back to you, listening right now. We all face environments that fail to recognize our potential.
Every single one of us.
We all encounter systems that hand us the wrong map, or no map at all. We all have rooms where we feel untranslated.
Think about the barriers in your own life right now. What obstacle, what closed door, what agonizing delay is actually a classroom waiting to be recognized? Where is your tuition currently being paid, and are you paying attention to the lesson?
Exactly. And to leave you with a final thought to mull over, a tool you can use today, let's borrow Gino's most powerful conceptual mechanism, the braided scene.
Oh, this is a great exercise.
I want you to look at a recurring frustration or a painful setback in your own life right now. Maybe it's a creative project that just failed, a relationship that is deeply strained, or a professional room where you feel like you don't belong and are constantly overlooked.
Just pick one.
If you were to sit down tonight, pull out a journal, and write that moment out as a braided scene, identifying the literal physical action of what happened, the hidden historical wound it triggers inside you, the symbol it represents in your life, the choice you were being forced to make between bitterness or growth.
And the revelation waiting for you on the other side.
Right. What would you discover? What would you discover about the resilient, self-educated leader that you are currently under construction to become?